The Hedges Lecture is an annual award that has been presented by SREE since 2016. The lecture is named for Larry Hedges to honor his work developing statistical methods, advocating for improved rigor of education and social science research, and providing foundational leadership to SREE. The award is meant to provide an outlet for us as a SREE community to honor the central role that methodological development and advocacy for scientific rigor play in improving educational research. With this in mind, I am excited to introduce the 2019 Hedges Lecture, Professor Judy Singer. Judy is the James Bryant Conant Professor of Education at Harvard. She is perhaps most well known for her contributions to the implementation of strong statistical methods in applied research in general, and more specifically for her book with John Willett, Applied Longitudinal Data Analysis, which has been cited by well over 10,000 times. Judy was the first woman elected to be a member of the National Academy of Education and as a fellow of the American Statistical Association. In 2012, she was appointed by Barack Obama to be a member of the Board of Directors of the National Board of Education Sciences, and perhaps most relevant for this meeting, she was a founding board member of SREE. As you will see in this talk, Judy's sightlines are far beyond the usual for a statistician in education. For the past 11 years, she has served as the Senior Vice Provost for Faculty Development and Diversity at Harvard. In this position, she has overseen all aspects of faculty affairs, especially recruitment, retention, and promotion for all Harvard schools, including the arts and sciences, education, engineering, and the medical schools. This view has allowed her to provide mentorship to many young researchers in the education, particularly women, as well as the insight to push our community to answer hard and important questions about the relevance of our work to the world. I want to close this introduction with a quote from one of Judy's articles in JREE recently. In it, she writes, "With research of all kinds being seen as suspect by leaders in the US federal government and in many quarters of the press, let's use recent changes in graduate schools to produce not only methodologically sophisticated graduates, but also practitioner graduates who will enter leadership positions at the district, state, and federal levels. They will not be conducting empirical research themselves, but they can commission it, support it, and use it. If they demand high-quality evidence about the effects of their educational programs, policies, and practices, the demand for rigorous research will continue." Given our conference theme this year, I cannot imagine a better person to kick off this meeting. Please join me in welcoming our 2019 Hedges Lecturer, Professor Judy Singer.
I want to thank Beth. I want to thank the members of the board of SREE and everybody here for welcoming. I've given a lot of thought over the last few months to what I could talk to this group about. And as Beth says, my talk is going to reflect my years of work in educational statistics, but it's also going to reflect my perch on academia, where I have spent the last 11 years focusing on faculty appointments at Harvard and giving a very broad swath of what happens in the academy. So I'm going to start out by talking about 4 inspirations for today's talk. 2 of them are philosophers of science and 2 of them are statisticians. I'm then going to talk about my personal research trajectory, actually going back to my graduate school days and how I ended up where I am today. And then I'm going to talk a bit about where we might go from here, and then befitting my self-appointed role as asking the first question, I'm going to ask the first question. And I'm going to ask it of all of you, okay? So I'm going to start out with 2 philosophers of science. My first philosopher of science is John Oliver.
Science. The thing we love and respect so much, we only allow scientists to be portrayed by the likes of Arnold Schwarzenegger, Nicolas Cage, and Al Pacino. That is how much we respect them and the complexity of the work they do. Science is constantly producing new studies, as you would know if you've ever watched TV.
A new study shows how sugar might fuel the growth of cancer.
A new study shows late-night snacking could damage the part of your brain that creates and stores memories.
A new study finds pizza is the most addictive food in America.
A new study suggests hugging your dog is bad for your dog.
A new study showing that drinking a glass of red wine is just as good as spending an hour at the gym.
Yes!
What?
Yes!
That last one, no! That last one doesn't even sound like science. It's more like something your sassy aunt would wear on a T-shirt. And when studies aren't blanketing TV, they're all over your Facebook feed with alerts like study finds liberals are better than conservatives at smizing, your cat might be thinking about killing you, and scientific study shows that bears engage in fellatio. And by the way, I'm not interested. Let me know when bears start engaging in some mutually pleasurable 69ing. Hashtag bear pleasure, hashtag feminism. Exactly. Time.com once even ran the headline, scientists say smelling farts might prevent cancer, which I would say was the most unfortunate thing Time ever published. But then, this is a magazine that once did a cover story on those Asian American whiz kids. The point is, there are now so many studies being thrown around, they can seem to contradict one another. In just the last few months, we've seen studies about coffee that claim it may reverse the effects of liver damage, help prevent colon cancer, decrease the risk of endometrial cancer, and increase the risk of miscarriage. Coffee today is like God in the Old Testament. It will either save you or kill you, depending on how much you believe in its magic powers. And after a certain point, all that ridiculous information can make you wonder, is science bullshit? To which the answer is clearly no, but there is a lot of bullshit currently masquerading as science.
So, I think he said it all. You can actually go Google that yourself and watch the entire thing. It's a stitch. My second inspiration is another philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, who published a book in 1962 called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. How many people have read it? Yeah, okay. It's a terrific read. It's kind of book that's worth going back to again and again. And I went back to it for this talk because I was thinking about what Kuhn was saying about the structure of scientific revolutions and what implications it might have for us at SREE. So Kuhn was arguing that scientific progress wasn't just this linear accumulation of facts over time, but that normal science was punctured by paradigm shifts. In fact, this is where paradigm shifts come from. So I will read this to you. Paradigms are universally recognized scientific achievements that for a time provide model problems and solutions to a community of practitioners. Acquisition of a paradigm and the more esoteric type of research that it permits is a sign of maturity in the development of any scientific field. But a paradigm can insulate the community from those socially important problems that are not reducible to the puzzle form, because they cannot be stated in terms of the conceptual and instrumental tools the paradigm supplies. And I'm going to argue today that it's time for us to be thinking outside the paradigm, that we have developed a paradigm that has become normal science, I'll talk more about that, and that there are very important problems in education that do not conform to the paradigms that we have been working on in this organization, and that it's time to actually think a little bit more broadly. The other two inspirations for today's talk, one is my doctoral advisor, Fred Mosteller, who was the founding chair of Harvard's Statistics Department. And Fred was, he was an out-of-the-box thinker. So when the Coleman Report came out, he started a faculty seminar at Harvard and produced a book with Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who went on to be a senator, called On the Equality of Educational Opportunity, which was basically on the Coleman Report. And subsequent to that, he started writing papers calling for experimentation in education. So he was taking the Coleman Report to task for being an observational study, and the selection effects that we all know plague observational studies. And he came out with several papers in the early 1970s that were designed to call the educational research, and in fact the whole social policy community, to task for not thinking that we could pull off randomized trials. So here's Fred in 1972. Strengthening our education system will require experimentation. When we speak of experiments, we are not talking about innovation in the let's first try this and then try that sense. Instead, we mean large-scale field experiments with honest controls. A few years later, he went on to say something that people don't actually know where the quote is coming from, but Fred talked about doing research without careful experimentation was fooling around with people. And so Fred was definitely calling for this new approach to be taken to educational research. And I started graduate school in the fall of 1976, so I came into this crucible. But at the same time that he was calling for experimentation, he was also calling for being flexible. And that's the other point that I want to be making here. The Green Book here, Data Analysis and Regression, came out in the spring of 1977, my first year of graduate school. And in the beginning of it, he and John Tukey write, in many social problems where the causes are multiple and entangled, if indeed there are identifiable causes, it's hard to choose the variables. This groping for causes is a process that is endless, and one person's causes are another person's consequences. And in fact, in what came to be known as the Green Book, he talks a lot about the need for flexibility. So he was simultaneously calling for experimentation where there was no experimentation, but not being so hidebound to an experimental approach that you wouldn't think about a broader perspective. Fred's perspective came from his advisor, John Tukey. Sam Wilkes was actually his official advisor, but John was his unofficial advisor. This is from a paper written in 1962 that I would recommend in the Annals of Statistics, which was a very serious mathematical statistics journal. And it was called The Future of Data Analysis. For a long time, I thought I was a statistician interested in inferences from the particular to the general. But as I have watched mathematical statistics evolve, I've had cause to wonder and doubt. I've come to feel that my central interest is in data analysis, which I take to include procedures for analyzing data, techniques for interpreting the results of such procedures, ways of planning the gathering of data to make its analysis easier, more precise, or more accurate. So that's 1962. It could be written today. It's a really quite prescient statement. John went on to publish a book in 1977 at basically the same time that the Green Book came out. Called Exploratory Data Analysis. A mimeograph version of this had been circulating around academia, and these two books came out simultaneously. And John talked about exploratory data analysis as a mindset that starts from data, not models. We're going to come back to that. Starting from data, not models. And minimal assumptions. And because of the error, you had to be able to do everything by hand. And so it's really remarkable to think back to a time when people were doing exploratory data analysis by hand. And there were a few people in the room who were nodding who can actually remember this. In 1980, John came out with a paper in the American Statistician called We Need Both Exploratory and Confirmatory. And I'm going to come back to that point in a few minutes. So with those as inspirations, I took my first job during graduate school. It was a summer job. I was an intern at Apt Associates. And I got assigned to work on the National Daycare Study. And the National Daycare Study at the time was one of the largest social science research projects. It had an $8 million budget, which in today's dollars would be about $35 to $40 million. It was a huge study. It had two components in it. It had a 49-center quasi-experimental design where we had 14 treated centers where we had actually intervened, but they weren't randomly assigned, and 35 untreated centers that were doing business as usual. And then there was actually a little RCT embedded in it. In the Atlanta Public Schools, there were 8 centers that agreed to be randomized. Teachers were randomized, students were randomized, and the treatments were what was thought at the time to be the important predictors of child outcomes, which were caregiver-child ratio and caregiver education. I spent that summer analyzing data, and I actually worked at Apt for 5 years before I left to finish my dissertation. One of the problems with this study was it had all of this experimental manipulation. It also had this quasi-experimental manipulation, but the bet was on the wrong variables. And so I spent several years analyzing these data and convincing myself and convincing my colleagues, which is a really scary thought because I started this when I was 21 years old and I left when I was about 25 years old, convincing my colleagues that the bet was on the wrong variable and that the variable that was in fact the predictor of what was going on in the classrooms was group size. And in fact, modern childcare actually regulates group size in that way. The other thing that happened was this gave me a problem to study for my dissertation. We were interested in finding the relationship between these aggregate characteristics of the daycare centers and the classrooms and these individual child outcomes, and that's what my dissertation was on, basically what we would now call multi-level modeling. So, mid-'80s, I take a job at Harvard. I was telling somebody yesterday, John Willett takes a job at Harvard 6 months after. The reason we got hired is that Tony Bragg chaired the search committee, and he got a job at the University of Chicago, and so instead of hiring one of us, they hired both of us. To this day, they have never told us who they would have hired if they could only hire one of us. And John and I decided that we were going to put our energy into developing a rigorous program of teaching statistical methods to our students. Starting out, I taught a course in research design out of Cook and Campbell. I don't need to read that quote. Then we wrote a book with Dick Light called By Design, which gave rise to the quote that I was misquoted at here a few years ago. You can't fix by analysis what you bungled by design. And we were laboring along, doing our work. And then finally, in 2002, there were two catalysts for change. One was the National Academy of Sciences came out with a report, Scientific Research and Education, that talked about what was going on in other fields. It's a theme I'm going to go back to. What's going on in other fields that education should learn from. And that led to the creation of IES, which we now know as something that's been instantiated, but at the time, it was really rather remarkable that, that the government would invest this kind of money in education. So with that, SREE is born. In 2004, Larry Hedges, Barbara Foreman, sitting right behind Larry, and Mark Consis, who deserves credit, but who doesn't come to the meetings that much anymore, they start discussing the idea of forming an association. I mean, you had to realize, how prescient this was. I think I could say that you guys had no idea that this number of years later, you'd be sitting in a room and having 600 people at a conference. It's really mind-blowing, and I think the testament to both Larry and to Barbara for thinking that this could possibly be is something that we all owe a true debt of gratitude. So they start. IES supports the effort. There are two conferences. The first one, let me go back there, was in 2006. It was in Lansdowne, Virginia. So how many people were there? Yeah, quite a few people, okay? And then the next conference was an invitation. The first one was invitational. The second one was an open conference. And this one was out in Crystal City, so I guess we're going back to our roots next year, going out to Crystal City. And if you take the time to look at the program, you will see that I was the closing speaker at that conference. How many people were at that conference? Okay. How many people remember anything I said? Hopefully no one, okay? So, let me tell you what I said. And it was March 4th. So this is basically 11 years to the date later. These were my notes for the closing comments at the first SREE Open Conference. The goal that we had was to use these new standards that the National Academy Report on Scientific Research and Education and that IES was putting out to basically become normal science. Going back to Kuhn, that if we could actually transform the field and establish that these methods were, quote, normal science, they were not unusual, they were really part of standard operating procedure, and that we would do that in education similar to what epidemiology was and continues to be in public health. So I went back to my notes, and I actually talked about how we would define success. And so let me tell you what I said. Increased numbers of grants would be funded. Well, that clearly has happened. Increasing numbers of papers would be published. This was before JREE was established. So JREE was established, And it's not just in JRE that we see this kind of work, so it's really changed the field. Increasing numbers of graduate students would be prepared. How many of you are graduate students? Yeah, a lot of graduate students. It's always great to see the graduate students here, because that's the future. And increasing numbers of faculty would be hired. I mean, there really has been a transformation in terms of the field in what we see in education schools and allied schools. There was another thing I called for that didn't happen. We'd come up with a descriptor of what educational researchers who adopted this paradigm were similar to what an epidemiologist is. And education scientist has not really taken hold in the same kind of way. I don't think anybody really identifies themselves as an education scientist. So we still don't have the word. So that leaves us at my favorite crossroads. This is an actual intersection of Research Road and Linear Park. It's in Australia. So where should we go? Mostly what we were setting out in 2004 and 6 and 8 has been accomplished. So the question is, what should the future be? And I'm going to make the argument that it's time to broaden our paradigm. So in 1980, John Tukey published this paper that I referenced earlier, that we need both exploratory and confirmatory. Singer in 2019, in a much less elegant and collapsed way, I need better phrasing, we need studies that support causal inference. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have them, but we also need other high-quality studies that, to borrow from Kuhn, address socially important problems not reducible to the puzzle form being QEDs and RCTs. So I'm going to talk about 3 particular things that I'd like to see more of. The first 2 are things that I've done some work on, and I'm just going to talk about them briefly. One is longitudinal analysis. Second is some assessment work. And the third I'm going to talk about is data science and machine learning. And I'm going to talk about that not from the perspective of having done the work, because I have not, but from the perspective of seeing what's going on in other disciplines and how machine learning and data science is taking the world by storm. And we ignore it at our peril. So let me start out with longitudinal studies. As Beth kindly mentioned, ALDA, Applied Longitudinal Data Analysis, it came out, it's over 15 years ago. And John and I were making the claim that education is about learning and learning is about change, that measures of status, even final status, are not really telling us about learning, and that we need truly longitudinal data, not just 2 waves of data. I went to the database of JRE papers. I did not read every paper, take my word for it, but I did do a keyword search on the word longitudinal, and of the 267 papers published in JRE since it was founded by Larry and Barbara, 91 of them include the word longitudinal, so it's about 1/3 of the papers. But when I looked to see what analytic methods were being used for these longitudinal data, I was actually quite disturbed. So thinking about measures of change, so individual growth modeling or multi-level model for change is one option. Studying whether and when events occur, so survival analysis or event history methods. Of the 91 papers in JRE that included the word longitudinal, 23 of them included either the words growth model or change over time. So well over 2/3 of the papers that had longitudinal data are not looking at change over time. I took a look at a few of them. They're primarily looking at final status. And yes, people have been randomized, but that's not the same as looking at change over time. And I was actually more astonished to find there wasn't a single paper that used the word survival analysis or, in sociology, event history analysis. Not one paper, despite lots of papers that were looking at questions that are so appropriate for survival analysis in terms of retention, dropout, attrition. Whenever you're asking questions about whether something happens, if it's happening over time, it's really a question about when something happens. So I'm going to give a 2-minute lecture on survival analysis just because clearly the group needs it. And I'm going to do it in the context of MOOC completions, massive online open courses. So basically, I'm arguing if you are ever looking at an outcome that is whether something happened, you should probably be asking the question, when did it happen? It's much more powerful statistically. Justin Reich was a former student of mine and was working on Harvard X, which is Harvard's big online project. And one of the things that people fuss about in online courses is that most people don't complete. And so question about why is it that people are signing up for these courses and not completing was a major, major concern. And in fact, it still is a major concern. So what Justin did is he came up with a simple idea. Maybe they didn't sign up intending to complete. Think about how many books you've started that you didn't finish. So he did something truly clever. This is not experimental. He asked people, what's your intent in doing this? And he gave them 5 categories, and they line up perfectly. No response, so people who wouldn't even answer the question. Those people really drop out. So if you want to know if somebody's not going to complete, they won't even bother to answer your question, okay? Those people drop out, and then he's got it as browse, unsure, audit, and then complete. And you can see that the complete people are over on the side. And these are just survival curves that are estimated to talk about the percentage of the course that people have completed as a function of what they said they were intending to do. It's a very strong predictor of the future. Survival analysis can easily be used in the context of an RCT. Since I'm talking about MOOCs, here's a survival analysis in the context of an RCT on one of these affirmation interventions. I'm good enough. I can do this work. I'm going to complete the course. I've never really believed that these things work, but here's some evidence. This is a randomized trial where they had an online MOOC for learning English. This was in China, and they randomly assigned some of the people to do this affirmation task, and the other group was assigned to just treatment as usual. And in fact, the treatment of this affirmation did have a statistically significant effect. So I hope that some of you will start thinking that it's not just enough to do an RCT or a QED. You should be thinking about the analytic methods that you're using to analyze the data. Longitudinal studies are increasing in popularity everywhere. Here I'd have a keyword search on the word randomized trial, not even controlled, but I just used RCT to make it easy. This is across 4,000 journals in one of the online databases. So you can see education RCTs are going up. These are RCTs not in education. They're really going up. But this is the keyword longitudinal in education and the keyword longitudinal outside of education. So there are more longitudinal studies being done than there are RCTs. That is especially true in education with all the state data systems and all the available data. And I just hope people start to think more about not just the design, which is important, but also the analysis. Now I'm going to talk about another project that I've been involved in. What's interesting to me as I was thinking about this talk is I've been working on this project for several years, and I'd come to SREE and I would never think of presenting it here because it wasn't a causal study. And so it didn't have a place in SREE. I was asked in 2015 by Mike Foyer, who at the time was the president of the National Academy of Education, if I would chair a study on international assessments, on their methods and on their policy uses. And in Mike's pitch to me, he said, I'm calling you up to ask you to do this because you know nothing about this. And he said, that makes you Switzerland. And that the people who actually study this stuff are so focused on their own particular positions that if we have one of them chair it, people will say this is not going to be an independent review. So would you take the time to chair this study, which I did. We held a pair of workshops, and we came out with a report that came out last April. So I never thought of presenting it here. I'd come here. I'd be working on that. I'd be up in my room working on it, but I wouldn't present it. But when the report was coming out, the folks at Science invited me and Henry Brown, my co-author, to write a paper. So the paper's good enough for Science, but it's not good enough for JRE. And the thrust of the paper was calling into criticism the focus on rankings in international assessments. And the same points actually apply to domestic assessments. It's not just about international assessments. There is an obsession with rankings, and that's how the data get presented. And they get presented and reified, and I can tell you that these international assessments get more coverage in newspapers and magazines than anything that's being published here. This is like candy for the media to just talk about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about rankings, and I'm going to show you my favorite graph of all time. Okay, and I've seen a lot of graphs. Okay, all right. So get ready. This is from a Japanese newspaper, and this is how they presented the results of the PISA assessments that came out after the 2015 assessment. So this is about in 2017. And they are bragging about the standing of Japan, especially in scientific literacy, because the rankings for Japan kept on going up. Japan was strong, and you can see that it was strong, but you can see clearly that it's going up. If you look at the data, what you will see is that in the 2009 assessment, it was ranked 5th in the world with a score of 539. In the 2012 assessment, it was ranked 4th in the world with a score of 547, so things were looking good. But by 2015, although it was ranked 2nd in the world, the score had actually gone down below where it was in 2009. This is like one of the single most misleading graphs I've ever seen. It's just crazy. Here's another one. This is the coverage of the PISA scores in Chinese Taipei. The results of PISA 2015 are released. The reading achievement, it's actually not the achievement, it's the ranking, regressed to 7 years ago, and actually the score was higher. So they're ignoring the underlying continuous data and just focusing on the ranking. This article went on to say, do you believe it? The falling of Taiwan in PISA reading is due to a lack of patriotism. Could you imagine that in a US newspaper? But in a lot of these Asian countries where the kids are scoring high, they are told they are representing their country, they are brought into the assembly, and they are celebrated as the people who were sampled to represent their countries, and they get all pumped up, and in fact the scores are higher, but for a whole host of reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with the education systems. But these Asian countries are being lauded as having the secret sauce. One of the things that we did in this report is something that would be near and dear to the SREE folks. We came up with a continuum of research questions, and we made the point, which everybody here would understand, that the questions that we want to answer with these data are actually not necessarily the questions that we can answer. So what we really want to answer are causal relationships, and in fact, it's almost impossible. We've come up with some really interesting natural experiments that have been able to establish some causal connections, but it's very, very unusual. Identifying best practices, and I'm going to talk about best practices in a second. One of the best practices that has come up out of these international assessments and secondary analysis is that the Asian countries, on average, score much higher than the European and US and Canadian countries. And so clearly, the Asian countries are doing something different, and all we have to do is copy what they're doing. Leave that in your head. I'm going to come back to that in a second. To describe and compare achievement, that's actually not so bad, but what they're really good at is disturbing complacency and spurring reform. They are terrific at getting headlines. They are terrific at getting the attention of policymakers. So here is a cautionary tale, what happened in Britain. So Nick Gibbs is the minister, he's a member of parliament, and he's the minister of education in Britain. And he starts seeing the high scores of the students in Shanghai and in other Asian countries. And he brings over to Britain a group of math teachers from Shanghai who are going to teach the British math teachers how to teach math, because they know how to teach math. Building on this, he comes up with an initiative that he rolls out. There is not a randomized trial in sight. There was a small little pilot. They committed 41 million pounds, that's over $50 million, to roll out this program of, quote, mastery maths, which is what is taught in a lot of the Asian countries. And they're just going to roll it out wholesale in Britain, which is what they did. I mean, it's the perfect opportunity to conduct an RCT, and they didn't even think to do it. And then they did something even crazier. They got a textbook publisher to translate all the textbooks from Shanghai into English, so these poor British teachers were being given these textbooks as if that is going to change the achievement of the students in these schools in England. I don't know about you, but I did not learn my math in grade school from textbooks. I learned it from my teacher. And the notion that translating the textbooks is actually going to do something, they spent a fortune. And if they had been here, if they felt that this was an organization where they might learn something, we might have actually gotten a randomized trial out of this, or maybe they could have partnered with the US and Canada. They also use textbooks in English, but instead they just went it alone and threw out all this money, my editorial comment. So now I want to talk about data science and machine learning. And as I said, it's not that I'm doing work on this, it's just that I am involved in conversation after conversation where this is the topic du jour. In the last week alone, we've done 2 tenure reviews of people in artificial intelligence and visualization, artificial intelligence and society. This is just coming at us like a tsunami. Right after I was invited to give this talk, I thought I would want to talk about this, so I started cutting out of the newspaper every time I saw it in the fall. New schools of data science or artificial intelligence. MIT in the fall announced a $1 billion investment in a school for artificial intelligence. It actually opened up this last week, and it will have students in the fall. MIT now estimates that 40% of their undergraduates are majoring in computer science. That's an engineering school for sure, but that is not where the students were. They were at all other forms of engineering, and now it's all computer science all the time. UC Berkeley, its fastest growing class is data science. They're creating a division of data science. Jim Ryan, my former dean at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, his first gift at the University of Virginia, announced just a few weeks ago, is a gift for setting up a school of data science. As I was preparing this talk, I went online to see what had happened. I went to Google News. In just the week I was preparing the talk a few weeks ago, 3 new data science programs are opening up. This is a tsunami that is coming upon us, and we have a lot to learn. I'll give a little brief data science introduction for people who have not seen this. This Venn diagram is by a fellow named Drew Conway. I encourage you to go to his website. He's a pretty well-known data scientist. And he came up with this Venn diagram to try to explain to people what data science was or is. And you can see the 3 big circles are substantive expertise, math and statistics knowledge, and that traditional research, that's where I sit, and I think that's where most of the people in this room sit, in that intersection. But that little pink circle over there on the left are hacking skills or computer science skills. And when you add that to the mix, you move people who are in traditional statistics and traditional research over into the data science world. Notice I'm not going up to the machine learning space where substance isn't involved. I'm arguing that we should really be in the data science space where we take our expertise on education, but we also take our math and statistics knowledge and we layer on it what John Tukey didn't have. He had pencil and paper, we have computers. And what we have with computers can really change the way we see the world. Hadley Wickham is another data science guru. He's at RStudio, and he's written the little tidyverse R routines and ggplot and some of these really cool data science routines. He has a blog post. These people don't write papers, they write blog postings. 3 main steps in any data science project: collect data and questions, analyze it using visualization and models, and communicate the results. If you go back to Fred Mosteller and John Tukey's Green Book, that's exactly what they were saying. And so data science is really what must, in my view, and it's not just my view, David Donahoe at Stanford has also made this claim, that if you think about data science and you think about exploratory data analysis a la Tukey and Mosteller, they really are the same thing, but with a computer. So statistics has had an ambivalent, as a discipline, has had an ambivalent relationship. In 1998, this is pretty early in the process, a fellow named Jeff Wu got a big endowed chair at the University of Michigan. They were setting up a data science program, And Jeff is now at Georgia Tech, but at the time he wrote a paper. It's never actually come out. It's a presentation that's on the web, and it's called Statistics Equals Data Science, and there's actually a subtitle, Statisticians Equal Data Scientists. And so he was making the claim that this was coming and the opportunity was really there. Leo Breiman, who was a statistician at UC Berkeley, who passed away shortly after this article came out, published an article in Statistical Science, which is a pretty serious statistics journal that's accessible, called The Two Cultures of Statistical Modeling. And in this, he talked about those people who start out with models and those people who start out with data. And he was making the claim that if you only start out with models, you're going to miss a lot, because if you start out with data, you're going to see some things that you might not have seen with your models. Then the statistics community starts to get really scared. You start to see, if you go to the stat meetings, you start to see, are we being taken over by data science? Are we missing the boat with data science? Are we being excluded from data science? Marie Davinian was president of the American Statistical Association in 2013, and she comes out with a paper that says, aren't we data science? Can't we claim it? But in fact, this is a real battle that's going on. So let's use a little data science to see how randomized trials, longitudinal data, and data science are doing. Google Trends only goes back to 2004, but that actually works pretty well. Okay, that's the trends in search terms for randomized trials. Sort of flat over time, wiggles. That's longitudinal, right in there. This is data science. The world is changing, and we ignore it at our peril. It is just changing. My dear friend and husband, I should have anticipated that you would be sitting right underneath me when I did this, but I think I didn't. Okay, so good, I'll look at you straight in the eyes. So Larry gave the Hedges lecture several years ago, and it was a terrific lecture, and he wrote up the lecture and published it in SREE, and they sent it out to several reviewers, including me. And I wrote back and I said, you didn't say anything about data science. And you were talking about building usable knowledge and what are the challenges for the future. And you were talking about all sorts of things that are so important. So please don't make me, I am not trying to underestimate what you did. But in terms of the replication crisis, obviously that's a big issue. In terms of some of the sequential trials that we were talking about, incredibly exciting. But from where I sit in my perch at Harvard, what I'm seeing is this data science tsunami. So Larry added this to the paper. We should be aware of the challenges and opportunities posed by the big data revolution. I am skeptical that administrative and other incidental data collections can entirely replace design data collections. I agree with you on that. I actually agree with this, but it's the recognition that there's just this change that's coming. But more data can be helpful in myriad ways that we don't understand. I was also reacting to something that I found really strange. The National Academy of Education had another workshop, sort of along the lines of the one that I worked on international assessments, on big data. And when I heard that I was not on this, but when I heard they were doing something on big, and I don't like the term big data, but I heard they were doing something on big data in education, I was really excited because I thought they were going to be talking about all the things that we in education could be doing using some of these forms of information. And instead, the report talks about all the problems. And it talks about privacy. It talks about how to protect data. It talks about FERPA. It talks about how to, what they don't know. I mean, it's an incredibly, it's a report that is focused on everything that could go wrong and almost nothing that could go right. And I think there are so many opportunities that we in this room and our brethren outside of this room could be working on in this realm, whether it's administrative data that we do have access to, real-time learning processes. Every MOOC has keystroke data. It is massive. You can, and they're talking about getting permission from the learners to look at eye movements. so you can see what they're actually looking at from their camera and what strokes are going on. The size of these data sets, but the opportunity for getting insight into what is going on in people's minds as they're engaging with material is just enormous. Soon wearables, so I got Mutsu, that's the name of my Apple Watch, about 2 months ago. It's keeping track of everything I'm doing. And we have phones everywhere, just enormous amounts of data. And then in education in particular, text data. We have enormous amounts of text data that we could be using natural language processing to get behind. So I think that there are just lots of opportunities. Even the FDA, which is sort of the mother or father of using randomized trials to evaluate evidence, is moving into a real-world program. So they talk about the real-world evidence program. Some people say that this is all talk, no action. But they're talking about real-world data, RWD, and real-world evidence, where there's an interest in using not just what goes on in randomized trials, but in other kinds of studies. They always did this for aftermarket effects and side effects, but they're now doing it in several other contexts as well. This is a quote from Scott Gottlieb: "As the breadth and reliability of real-world evidence increases, so do the opportunities for the FDA to use this information." So data science is here. It is not going away. This is the Harvard Data Science Initiative. Everybody here at a university, undoubtedly, there is a data science initiative on your campus. I can pretty much guarantee it. At Harvard, one of the things that I'm particularly excited about is we've created a secondary field for all of our doctoral students. Anybody who's a doctoral student in this room, whether at Harvard or somewhere else, go check this out. These are the skills that are going to be demanded in the next phase of research. There are some pockets of change. I'll give a shout out. Sean Reardon gave a talk a few years ago where he talked about the Stanford Education Data Archive. That is not an RCT. It's not even a QED, but it's got a lot of big data and a lot of administrative data. But it's one pocket. Here's another pocket. Raj Chetty gave a talk a few years ago on his Opportunity Insights project. Raj was at Harvard at the time. He left to go to Stanford, where he created a course on using big data, and he's taken that course back to Harvard now. It is being offered this spring. It is the third most enrolled course in Harvard College. It had never been offered, and it is amongst the most popular courses this semester. And this is a gateway drug. This is an introductory class for students who are coming in about how can we use big data to solve economic and social problems. Those students are going to want to go take additional courses. Those students are going to come to our graduate schools of education and our schools of public policy. And what are we going to have for them if they've already gotten this in their sophomore year of college? It's just a different generation with hacking skills, the likes of which I don't think I could do, but clearly they can do. I went back to SREE. There is one paper that used machine learning. Liz Stewart gets the shout out here, and Jennifer Hill, with 2 political scientists. And in fact, the analyses do reveal that machine learning actually did better than regression methods for some of these things. Our friends at SREE asked for this advertisement. There's going to be an upcoming special issue on what they call new data. Okay, and I don't like big data, so maybe new data is a good phrase. But they solicited papers, and they got papers in that's coming out when? Fall and winter. So take a look out for that. I'm sorry, I actually missed this session because I was writing about this session as I was preparing this talk this morning. But this morning, there were 2 sessions that were using machine learning, and unfortunately, they've already happened, so I can't send you there. But I was at least heartened to see that they were on the program. And this is science fiction, except it's true. Significance is a joint publication between, it's a popular magazine for statistics, which is a really odd concept. And this was in my inbox as I was preparing this talk. Will artificial intelligence in the future of work, will our jobs be taken by machines? I didn't understand when I saw that headline, when they referred to our jobs, they were referring to statistician jobs. So there is a project called the Automated Statistician that aims to create an artificial intelligence for data science. This is data science to take over data science. Its website explains that there are relatively few people trained in the statistical and machine learning methods required to test hypotheses, make predictions, and otherwise create interpretable knowledge. And so the project hopes to fill this gap. And what it does is it produces graphs, tables, and English language text. It's a little wooden, but English language text that is interpreting the results of these analyses. It's a little on the mind-blowing scale. So there are legitimate concerns. I don't mean to make light of the legitimate concerns. This example from one of my colleagues, Gary King, on the parable of Google flu. Google flu totally overestimated the flu epidemics, and part of it was the algorithms were picking up winter search terms and overestimating the percentage of actual flu cases. But the algorithm gets tweaked, and the next year it works better. That's part of this data science approach, is that you're never done. You just learn. That's why the machine is learning, and you get better at the predictions. This is an article in Science that's talking about predictive analytics from the Food and Drug Administration, and basically raising questions about whether the data analytics are actually a good thing. And then I think we all know about these cases. Amazon scrapped secret AI recruiting tool that shows bias against women. So the whole question of whether these machine learning and artificial intelligence methods are just reifying all our biases is of serious concern, because they use stereotypes, they use patterns in data to then reinforce that work. And so there's a lot of work going on now in artificial intelligence, asking questions about fairness, asking questions about equity, asking questions about whether these algorithms are just reifying our problems instead of giving us new opportunities. So there definitely are issues. But I'm going to make the argument that it is time to reshape the arc. It is time to think outside our paradigm. I am not, please be clear, I am not talking about abandoning our abiding interest in causal inference and abandoning our abiding interest in randomized trials and QEDs. But I do think it's time that we think a little bit outside our paradigm. And so now I'm going to ask the first question of the speaker, except I'm going to ask it of all of you. Where do you think we should go? I think this is a subject for debate, and I'd like to open it up for people to express their points of view. So thank you very much.
First of all, I want to thank you for giving a very inspiring talk, and I want to also say that I'm with you on a lot of these things. I read the article about Ask Alexa, so all you have to do is say, run me an ANOVA, and the computer runs the ANOVA. You don't even have to bother putting in the codes. So I think that we really are in a very different time and a very different place. If you look at how we code today, we code so differently than how we used to code before. So much now is macros. You don't even have to think about things. They just happen for you in a menu-driven system. And I think the machine learning experience has really, it has taken over my life in a way I never thought that it would. So the point I would like to make is we have a cluster randomized trial going on right now, but it's the infusion of the opportunities that new data collection offers us that's making this trial even better. So, of course, we use the same kind of social emotional learning that we've always used, which are, you know, through phones, so the phone world. I mean, you carry your world in your phone. And then we're using machine learning for constructed responses for assessment. Now, I think that this is really something I'd like you to talk a little bit more about, because I think in a lot of ways this is really the future. We've pressed on the importance of assessments that are constructed, and we want students to do things that they haven't done before with problem solving, and then they're going to write these things, or they're going to type them in some way on some computer-based program, and then we have to score them and analyze them. And then the question becomes, well, which kind of machine learning programs are we going to use? And I would say, and I'm pressing you, Judy, because I know you're really good at this, what are the kinds of skill sets that we should be emphasizing for people to use as they enter into these new mediums of machine learning? Because if there's one thing you know better than anybody in this room are the different kinds of, quantitative skill sets that we need to be able to think about our new paradigms. So what would you suggest?
Well, what would you suggest?
Reread your books.
No, thank you, Barbara. By the way, that's Barbara Schneider from Michigan State. It's very interesting. I think there's a new generation of students, and we see it among our undergraduates and our graduate students, who just hack away at these things. We set up hackathons, and they come in, and they will just spend days taking these often social problems and trying to attack them using data science. So I think there's an energy going on among people who are in this world where this is crossword puzzles and Ken, but it happens to be data science. So it's work, but it's also just fun, and it is collaborative. So another feature of this is it's open. I mean, if you look at the way these data science tasks, anybody know about the Netflix challenge? So the Netflix challenge was set up to try to create algorithms that would be better than the old Netflix at coming up with, "Hi, Judith, we have new movies for you." And it is constantly updating. There's a training data set. People are given a common problem. Lots of people, there's often money involved. So the Netflix challenge involved a $1 million prize. So it creates an incentive. But I'll tell you about one that involved a $500 prize in a second. People use a training data set, and then the prize is determined by a new data set and how well the predictive models work. They are not trying to figure out what is causing you to want to watch that movie. They are just trying to predict your behavior. And so it's a different mindset. It's a mindset of, if I can predict, that's what I need to know. I don't need to know what's causing it. I just need to know what is predicting it. And so it's a very different mindset, but it's also very collaborative. It's not people working individually. It's people working in teams who are trying to attack problems. So I'd say coding skills are clear, and the coding skills will change every year. So there are changes going on right now. I mean, R and Python are obviously it, but that's it now. If you say that and put it in writing, it'll be out of date 5 years from now. This is a field that's constantly changing. Flexibility, willingness to put in time, collaboration, and what statisticians are really afraid of is the predictive analytics part will become so all-powerful that people will forget the statistics part of it. Randomized trials in data science are often called A/B testing because when you go to Amazon, it's feeding, you are constantly a subject in a study that is either a data science predictive activity or a randomized trial. It's just not called a randomized trial. So I think this is something that is so fluid, and these data science programs that are springing up everywhere and online, in person, they're just trying to keep up with it. And from the perspective of statisticians, how do we keep statistics in this? Some of these early data science programs, like the one at the University of Michigan that Jeff Wu was talking about when he got his endowed chair, statisticians were not really actively involved in that. In fact, on that initial program, there were like 25 speakers, and only one of them was a statistician. They were all engineers and computer scientists. So this is coming at us, and we ignore it at our peril. I'd love to see in some of the workshops before SREE some sessions on machine learning and on AI so that people, in an education context, so that people could actually see what could be learned, not just fussing about privacy, which is important, and bias, which is important. All these things are important, but I think we need to throw ourselves in to actually see what could be done. I will also say this is a young person's sport.
Hi there.
Hi.
Thank you for the talk. I had a question about your question.
Can you say your name?
I'm Alex Ebley from Columbia, or Teachers College. So my question is about the paradigm that you're sort of suggesting we go towards. It sounds great, but I think a lot of us got into this business because we were interested in taking out the trash of bad ideas. And so I was wondering if you could help us think about, other than prediction, a few paradigms or a few principles that might help us assess the quality of evidence provided using things that stray further from the sort of strict causal QEDs or RCTs.
The clear focus in a lot of this work is on prediction and making the predictions better. So if you talk to people who are working in machine learning and AI, they're never done. It's a process of just improving the algorithms, making them better, working on a training set, then trying it on another set, but this constant expectation that you're never going to be done. So it's not like once and done. It's really a continual process. I'd also say that some of the principles that we espouse here also have a role in the world of data science. Replication clearly has a role. Because you can do, I mean, that's the whole thing about having a training data set and trying it again, but try it again with another data set. So it's not as if we have a system, it's not as if some of our principles can't be applied. But the big shift difference, which in fact comes out of exploratory data analysis straight away, is look at the data and see what it's telling you. And that's very different from pre-registering your analyses and saying, that's the only thing that I'm going to look at. And so I think I can't give you a precise answer in the sense of here are 5 things that you should think about, but some of the ideas that we think about, we should take with us. But I think we've also been, I'm all for replication, so please don't interpret this as that we don't need replication. That's not what I'm saying. But it's not that we want to keep on hammering at that one problem. And so this is a mindset of thinking more broadly about what the opportunities are. And I think we're a mature enough science to do it. So if you go back to Kuhn and you actually read it now through this lens, you'll see this thread in there. You have to be a mature science to be able to look back and say, oh, I could think about doing this differently. And I think to some extent we are a mature science. Mark Schneider said the same thing today at his comments at lunchtime. It's not that we've won the war, and it's not like we're going to throw out RCTs, but that can't only be what we do, not with all these data that are around. And so we're going to have to come up with new ways of thinking about whether this actually works, quote, better than. It's also not an either or. If you go back to John Tukey's title, we need both exploratory and confirmatory. I think we need what we're doing, and I think we need to broaden our paradigm.
Okay. Hi, Judy. Thanks so much for your talk. My name is Vivian Wong. I'm from the University of Virginia. So one of the true pleasures of my job in the last couple of years has been exactly working with students and having the students bring to me their amazing data that they managed to collect themselves just by sitting on their computer at home, using basically this kind of machine learning, data scraping, natural language processing techniques. And so one of the things that really excites me about this is that it seems like we're also on this kind of threshold of this democratization of research, because you don't necessarily need to have a full apparatus, a whole research institute to be able to collect this data, that our graduate students could sit at home and sort of collect this data online on the internet on their own. And so as we've sort of seen with the internet more generally, there's some advantages, but then there's also some pitfalls in terms of having sort of research and data that's available out there for us to be able to use to be able to conduct research. So I was interested in hearing your thoughts as how can we as institutions, as teachers, as organizations, basically be a part of this movement in terms of being able to sort of provide some structure, but then also let growth and innovation happen on its own?
No, it's a really interesting question. I'll take two different takes on it. One is Mechanical Turk and all of these online internet. They're basically the college students of years ago. And all the psych studies were done on college students, and then people discovered that actually college students don't generalize to the population. All the studies were done on health were done on men, and they discovered that they actually don't generalize to women. And Mechanical Turk is just the latest version of a very selected subsample of people who are willing for a quarter to do a task for 10 minutes. I mean, it's so, I think some of the issues that we take on here seriously, especially when we're asking questions about generalizability of experimental work, carry over directly into this world. I mean, not all data are created equal. That's one piece of it. At the same time, there is so much data out there. The stuff that I'm really excited about is all the text data, because there is an enormous amount of textual data that is sitting out there unharvested, and natural language processing is an absolutely amazing tool. I mean, that's how SREE works. That's how Google Translates works, and it just gets better and better and better. The opportunities for using those kinds of data, we just fielded a faculty climate survey at Harvard, closed out last week. We have open-ended responses, and the question is, what are we going to do with all those open-ended responses? Typically in these kinds of surveys, nothing. We just include them to make people feel like we're listening to them. And then we just look at the quantitative responses, create some PowerPoints, and move on. But there are, and I was talking with Liz Stewart about this earlier today, there are so many opportunities to use that kind of information to make a difference. There's just an enormous amount of information out there, and separating out what has real data that has value and what is just chaff, I think is part of the challenge for the next phase of all of this.
Hi, Judy. Henry May, University of Delaware. So I've been doing RCTs of education interventions for over 15 years now, and I'm totally sold on the idea of good causal inference and understanding the efficacy of interventions. And I've published a lot of journal articles describing the efficacy of those interventions I've studied, and they've been cited, and it turns out now I'm learning that practitioners aren't paying any attention to this. So one of the things that I would argue in terms of where do I think we should go as a society of researchers studying educational effectiveness is to think outside of the box of journal articles. Not to say that we shouldn't be publishing journal articles, but that's not where it stops, right? And I would say that the lion's share of the work around disseminating knowledge happens after the journal article is published. And that we shouldn't necessarily think about just getting an intervention into What Works Clearinghouse and saying, this is what works, right? This works. If you're looking to buy something and implement something that works, you should buy this. That's not the way decision makers in schools and districts are thinking. They're not always thinking about what's the next thing I should buy. They're thinking about either, what do I need to design in order to solve this problem, right? Given my limited resource, I don't have any money to buy anything new, and I'm not going to convince anybody in my system to do the next fad, right? And so I think that as a society, producing evidence of what works is fantastic, but we need to think bigger picture, beyond the individual intervention. We need to think about the overarching strategies that are actually helping, that are driving the effects of the interventions, and what folks can learn beyond that. And so it behooves those that are developing interventions to not just think about, I'm going to evaluate this packaged thing that one must buy, but to think about the broader knowledge that's created about why something works and how that can actually infuse practice on a broader scale. In terms of our responsibility as researchers, we talk to each other a lot, right? But we should be talking to practitioners as well. Anybody that's in a decision-making position, they should be understanding that the decisions that they make have the potential to be informed by research. But it's not necessarily the first thing that's on their minds as they're making these decisions. But the more the research community establishes connections with the practice community, we can move toward a system where there's a synergy, where the research can actually do more to inform practice. But we've got a long way to go to get there.
No, I mean, this whole question of how you get information out and how you communicate with people is a true challenge, and it's only becoming more challenging. As part of this panel and study report on international assessments, we brought in people from other fields outside of education, from health, from aging, and what was interesting is they all said to us, oh, education gets so much more coverage than we do in health, which seemed a little mind-blowing to me. We also brought in Nick Lemon, a journalist, to talk about how education is covered in newspapers, which is really where a lot of people have gotten information. It's a great paper. It is extraordinarily depressing. Newsrooms are getting smaller. The way information gets disseminated is it's now on Facebook. It's not in it's not in standard media. And as you saw from John Oliver, that great philosopher of science, it's all over the place. I mean, that's funny, but it's serious. I mean, it's exactly to your point of how information gets communicated. And so I think that is a problem here. And there's also the political aspects of it. It's very interesting being now in an administrative position at a university where if someone came to me and said, we should do an RCT on our faculty, let's randomly assign half of them to this and half of them to that, I'd say, no. Okay? So in one setting, I can say, how do I sell this? And in another setting, I will say, I'm not doing that. So I can now see it from the other side. I don't have a good answer. I think it's a very legitimate question, but I think it's something that we all have to work hard to think through.
Hi, I'm Thomas Kelly Kumpel from Harvard. I was wondering, in terms of the big data work that you see going forward, and as innovative as it is, to what degree do you, why are we calling this a paradigm shift rather than kind of an extension of the tools we already have, right? It's kind of bigger, faster, you can do more stuff with it, but how do we distinguish kind of better tools from an actual paradigm shift?
So I think that's a terrific question. All you have to do is spend a day with data scientists and you'll realize it's not an extension, it's a paradigm shift. They really see the world differently. They do not start with models. And when I first was in this world, and I've been in a lot of conversations about teaching applied statistics, for example. Do you start with a model? A number of my former students here. Who's a former student? Yeah. Okay, all my former students here. You start with a model. Even though the way I taught was very much about exploratory data analysis, you start with a model. Data scientists don't start with models, they start with data. And so they're coming at the problem from exactly the opposite side. Here's some data, here are some interesting questions, and how will I attack it? And I think there's something in the middle where, and some of the most interesting data science courses are being co-taught by computer scientists and statisticians because they do see the world differently. But it is, I don't see this as an extension. I see this as actually a disruption with a real discontinuity. And if you spend some time talking to data scientists, I think you'll see it too. But they're not, in fact, I was in the context of a tenure review earlier this week where people were talking about the fields that are embracing data science and the fields that aren't. So the distinction was being made between the folks in genomics and genetics and those kinds of, they're all over this. Bioinformatics, they're all over it. Economics, political science, interestingly, has really embraced this in a big way. And then this is not a statement from me, this is a statement from someone who's on a tenure review said, it's really interesting, psychology and sociology, they're not doing it so much. And I would add in education. So this is somebody looking at, this is somebody in the world of data science looking at the fields that are embracing the work. And what's interesting is that the psychology, sociology, and education are not embracing it in the same kind of way. One of the things that is really interesting is digital humanities, where they're using text mining and natural language processing to go back through texts that have been analyzed using more traditional literary methods. But this is not just an extension. 10 years from now, we'll get back together, and we'll see which one of us is right. I'm not saying. And I taught your father, so you should know. I remember when you were born. Oh, God. Who feels worse about that?
So since you remember when he was born, I'm a little bit afraid now to comment. LaShawn Richburg-Hayes, I'm from Insight Policy Research. I have a comment, and then I wanted to respond to the question of where to go next. So my first comment is a few years ago, I can't remember what year it was, maybe it was 2012. I remember sitting right around here, and Tony Bright was giving the Hedges lecture. And I remember being with a group of people afterwards, no names, and we were all like, wow, this is the Peter Principle in operation, you know, promotion to the point of ineptitude. Because it was a shock and awe presentation that was just, wow, don't do RCTs, just do big data. And then I realized, you know, he was ahead of the curve, way, way, way ahead of the curve, because now you're saying a similar thing, but we're responsive because we have seen it now play out so many different ways and the usefulness of it. So that was just a personal aha moment being here. My other thought when Henry spoke of where to go next is I have always felt like we have done things sitting around a table, not situated where the problems are, coming up with solutions. And solutions for populations we are not part of. And so where do we go next in terms of helping practitioners? It seems to me that there is room for a larger toolkit. And one of the things that I think could be useful in that toolkit is a focus on continuous improvement and frameworks that does not preclude RCTs, but use them when appropriate, and does not necessarily come in with a pre-specified solution, but understands the problem that's being experienced, and working with practitioners who actually know a lot, or communities that know a lot to develop solutions, structure them, test them, learn, iterate. That, when appropriate, can be done in an RCT framework. It's not the methodology that drives that, it's the perspective and frame. And so as Henry was talking, it occurred to me that this is about delving in more deeply about what is going on. And you can do that in an exploratory way, or you can do that even observationally, working and talking to people to get to a better place. And that better place may involve an RCT down the line, but that RCT will be more likely to give you impacts because it's more informed about what may possibly work or not. So personally speaking, I would like to take a medication that had some African-American women in the sample, I'm just saying, right? Because it may more likely be able to help me, and those solutions have been informed in such a way. So I think moving forward, that would be a nice place to go. In this room in particular, where we're really focused on rigor, if we take the notion of opening up our toolkit and being wider with it, I think that will permit practitioners to also think in a more rigorous way. I've had experiences of working with practitioners in PDSA cycles, and it's not work I ever would present here. But what I've heard repeatedly is that it's helped them think differently about how they go about their work. It's helped them be more thoughtful about the types of data that they can collect. And they're not perfect data, but they're better data than what they were doing before, which was nothing. So if these are the folks who are making decisions, it I think, results in us needing to meet them part way. So that's my comment.
Thank you. No, and please please understand, I am not suggesting getting rid of RCTs. So I don't want to give that impression. But your ideas of a cycle, that's what we're talking about here, is that I think we had to double down or triple down on RCTs when nobody was doing it. And it was such a radical idea that we had to be at one extreme. I think we can come back into a better balance, and as we do that, invite more people into the conversation. There's an enormous amount of data out there, and you can see how these predictive models are being used by colleges and universities to try to figure out who's at risk of dropping out, who needs an intervention. There are ways in which these methods can actually be part of a cycle of it's essentially a cycle of continuous improvement. But I think there will still be places, lots of places for RCTs in this. It's just broadening out our toolkit.
Thank you. LaShawn took a lot of that. I'm Rebecca Maynard from the University of Pennsylvania. I just want to underscore, I guess my caution is, let's not just line up on the big data grab and the predictive analytics, because there is a role for the hammer and a role for the saw. Right. And I think that the predictive analytics is great for showing where we need to look, for hypothesis generation. It can be used as a piece of the toolkit when you're trying to understand and interpret causal inference research. LaShawn's point that the improvement cycles, doing improvement cycles absent any tests, sometimes you don't need the test because it's obvious you've cured the ill, but other times you can be totally wrong. You could have been getting better anyhow, and you could kill someone you didn't intend. So I guess what I would say with this is we need to make sure that those people who are doing the data analytics become part of the education research community, and that means they also have to understand the problems, they understand the complexity, the situations, the risks and advantages of using data of different types, and making sure that we're using the tools appropriately. So I think what you've highlighted so well in this presentation is the opportunities for all of us to stretch and learn. Let's call it continuous learning among the education scientists, and we all have our zones in this space where we are more and less equipped to take on those questions. So anyhow, thank you for raising this. I appreciate it.
No, one of the things that's interesting is about that Drew Conway Venn diagram, which has been reproduced in lots of different settings, is data science includes substantive knowledge, and machine learning doesn't. And so I'm arguing not just for machine learning's sake. I'm arguing that we need people in the conversation here who will, frankly, blow our minds with some of the things that they're doing, but they do have a grounding in education so that they actually understand these are not just numbers. There's context, and everybody went to school, so everybody thinks they know everything about education. That's not good enough. But I think at the same time, we resist it at our peril.
Is there a last question?
Okay. My name is Brooks Rosenquist. I'm from Denver Public Schools. And we actually had a very similar discussion among some of the analysts in one of our meetings of the research and evaluation team, where I felt like, even though I was telling the team, I felt even though like I had a great quantitative training, that the field is kind of moving past me in the sense of this kind of machine learning. And I told the team maybe in a few years we might all be replaced, similar to the slide. And when the analyst said, well, why aren't we doing this now? And I think I had to kind of think back to some of my training in grad school, when we had some of our quant classes taught by psychologists, and it was interesting that they put a lot of emphasis on model fit, right? But in the policy, the policy professors, it was all about just making sure you had enough variables so you didn't have bias, but we were just looking at, moving the needle, effect size, p-values. And when I asked about, my professors, why the difference, right? They were talking about how the psychologists were really trying to predict individual behavior, was we were trying to look at programs to move the needle and move, groups of people, the central tendency of these groups of people to a certain direction. So I felt like my answer to the analysts on the team was that, that's kind of the difference. We're not trying to predict individual behavior. We're trying to figure out these programs that are going to, we can, kind of apply them more or less uniformly to a heterogeneous group of people and move the needle in a certain direction that we want to move it. So I think my question then is, do I just kind of lack the imagination to figure out how we could apply these to our kind of current ways of education, like this kind of batch process we're doing of just applying these relatively uniform treatments to heterogeneous population? Or is it also kind of an issue of, does the way we administer education have to change too to really leverage this kind of knowledge, right? Because, it could be that, there's a lot of people that want to try to move to the more individual education where you could kind of foresee maybe this more individually predictive data and data modeling really, be leveraged in that more individual education.
Yeah, you're basically talking about the education version of personalized medicine. So personalized medicine is saying there are treatment effects, average treatment effects, there are local average treatment effects, all the same methods that we use, but in the medical context. And then there's this new wave, which is building on this data science bandwagon of personalized medicine. And so if you can look at my genetic profile, perhaps you could give me a better drug designed for my genetic profile or my microbiome or whatever particular measures that you want to have. Same question is true in education. Are we delivering treatments wholesale that work on average, or are we trying to personalize instruction for individual students? And I think the answer is both. But what these ideas are trying to introduce is personalized education, effectively. And then you can get into a whole thing about aptitude treatment interactions and all of those kinds of things. This talk was at one point going to build on Lee Cronbach's addresses to the American Psychological Association. You know that, on the two cultures of scientific psychology. One was observational and one was experimental. I just ran out of room in the talk, but it's the same principle over and over again. And what's interesting about it is these ideas have been around for a really long time. I'm using Mosteller and Tukey because Fred Mosteller was my advisor, but if I went to Stanford, I'd be using Lee Cronbach because it's the same set of ideas and we're constantly grappling in this kind of cycle between, are we looking at average treatment effects or are we looking at aptitude treatment interactions? And I think this is aptitude treatment interactions on steroids, where the number of variables that could be involved in the interaction just boggles my mind. But on the other hand, we're that complex and there's a lot of data on me. This thing is collecting data on me constantly, and Apple has it all. Thank you. Thank you all.